So, hello again. You are listening to the Blockchain Socialist Podcast. And for today's guest, I have Jaya Klara Brekke. She is working in strategy at NIM and is a researcher, having worked in academia quite a bit beforehand, and has released or published quite a lot of very interesting articles about Bitcoin, sort of in the very early days, and has a lot of really interesting thoughts, both from, I think, a critical point of view I've seen you write before, and then also sort of like maybe a little bit of cautious optimism that I think is really interesting, that I wanted to sort of dive into a little bit deeper with you. But yeah, hi Jaya, how are you doing?
Hello, thank you for inviting me. And it's good to be on this specific podcast because I feel it is a podcast that provides a space for people like me who I've started to kind of call the rigorous fence sitters. So people who keep a critical foot outside of the whole crazy world of crypto, and a kind of foot inside the messy parts of it, trying to actually make something out of that mess. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's definitely an extremely niche podcast, I think. But I like to think that it is helpful in some ways, and doing sort of the thing that I think, at least when I read some of your work, that you seem to want to do, which is to like hold space for discussion and debate, both critical and maybe optimistic. But maybe to start off, I think it'd be really interesting just to hear from you your story on how you got into cryptocurrency world so early.
Yeah.
Since, I think everybody always has like an interesting story about that.
Yeah. So I got into crypto. I mean, I guess I read the Bitcoin white paper maybe for the first time around 2010. And then 2011, something around 2011 or 2012, I kind of read it in more detail. I was at the time I was taking part in a European research project called DECENT, which stands for Decentralized Citizen Engagement Technologies. And it was a project led by Francesca Bria, current president of the National Italian Innovation Fund, and also a very interesting character. It's definitely worth diving into her history and the work that she's been doing with Evgeny Morozov, who runs the syllabus. She her and some other kind of quite forward-thinking partners at that time started this project, and it was one of the first kind of major ambitious projects that really dealt with the question of the politics around the data economy. So the emerging data economy, looking at who has control over data, and how the kind of economics around that can be reorganized. And one of the partners in the project was a kind of super interesting group called DINA, which is a think and do tank, led by also another very early Bitcoin person, Jaramil,
who I had on, who I published the
who's
interview
been
fairly
on the
recently, yes.
Yep, exactly. So I got to know Jaramil as part of the Decent project, and really looked closely at the Bitcoin white paper because of him. And the Bitcoin white paper and the kind of, let's say, the blockchain at that time was something that people in the Decent project were looking to kind of reconfigure for various social currency and new data economy experiments. So these were kind of like some of the kind of, I mean, before the kind of big crypto boom, it was really like the early altcoins, or the early kind of like innovative uses of blockchain that was then very quickly kind of overtaken by other dynamics. But so yeah, that was my introduction to crypto. And a few years later, I decided to write a PhD on the topic. So I wrote a PhD that was a political analysis of the Bitcoin protocol and the Ethereum protocol, and happened to write that PhD thesis, or be doing my research, exactly during the height of the Bitcoin scaling conflict and during the height of the Ethereum DAO hack. And those two events were super fascinating and super interesting for me, because my PhD was essentially kind of drawing out a lot of the technological determinism at the core of the proposition of both Bitcoin and Ethereum, And what was interesting about these events was it really showed the kind of the politics of these architectures, right? It really showed how even when we're, or perhaps especially when we're developing infrastructure and hard coded infrastructure, the question of who that infrastructure really benefits and how it might be reconfigured to benefit other types of people becomes a question of governance, a question of politics that cannot be kind of just solved through more and more decentralization or more and more technological solutionism. So these were two pivotal moments, I think, in the maturity of the thinking in the whole space, and really brought the question of governance to the foreground.
Yeah, I thought it's like those events I think are interesting because you have this maybe like strong group of crypto enthusiasts who tend to like to focus that crypto is apolitical, or that almost like they're trying to decentralize their way out of politics,
Exactly.
which is like it's really interesting. But then that always comes to like, yeah, there's always an issue that pops up. For example, with the scaling issue, with the Bitcoin scaling, of course, you had people who had different ideas and visions, and therefore like make up different maybe political camps in some like small type of way. And same with the DAO hack. And then I don't know if recently you saw just another thing that I think is also kind of related, is really interesting in the Juno network, which is like one of the it's like one of the blockchains within the Cosmos ecosystem. They recently voted to like expropriate the wealth of one of the whales of Juno, who owns like 10% of the supply. And
Right.
again, you see like these people being like, why are you bringing politics into this? Shouldn't we just leave it as it is? Because like, those are the rules in the beginning. But then it turns out that sort of like social or like human interactions or governance really sort of trumps this idea of like code is law. So
Yeah.
there's this like conflict between code is law and no, we should build something for what we actually want rather than.
Yeah. I mean, I think the code is law kind of perspective. It's so interesting, right? Because it's so kind of like time. I mean, what people kind of like found when these two big events was that, like, sure, code is law, but at some point code was also written, and many times it was written with a bunch of mistakes as well.
Yeah, so like I reached out after. I mean, I had read like a bunch of your work before, and then was always like kind of nervous to reach out because I thought you were like way cooler than me for some reason. But after listening to your speech with the events with Furtherfield, and I think they're called Der Haus Kunst,
Yeah.
where you like really well articulated, I think, a lot of my own positions in just like a way that was like better than I could say it probably. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about. I think it was an opening speech maybe, or one
Yeah.
of that you gave about some of the things that you are cautiously optimistic about, but then as well sort of like the immediate things that you would like, I guess, people to understand about this world.
Yeah, I did the opening keynote for this event, and it's an event with a super interesting bunch of people that are essentially led by some artist groups that are looking at the use of DAOs to organize artist economies and govern artist economies. So some very nice propositions there. So, and what I wanted to do was I wanted to take these kind of three words, or these three words that make out a DAO, right? A decentralization, organization, and autonomy, and talk a little bit about the kind of contradictory meanings that are often at play when people use these words. And I mean, I spent most of that talk just talking about decentralization. I don't think I got to the other two concepts because there's so much. I mean, I think you could run, three seminars on each, but yeah, the point I was making really was I was drawing on the kind of history of, my own experience with decentralization and decentralized organizing and decentralized politics as very much a response to power and to centralized power and to the concentration of power. And this is in kind of like my history in activism, let's say, more, and yeah, being a kind of political activist when I was younger, and how that kind of became super enmeshed with a very different understanding of decentralization that comes from Hayekian economics and Hayekian political economy. And I wanted to kind of explain how those two versions of decentralization, which really have been seen as at the opposite end of this political spectrum, really kind of become enmeshed in the world of crypto, and people, use the word decentralization sometimes to refer to others, to one, and other times to the other. And so, yeah, in that talk, I really tried to just kind of like flesh out what are the kind of problems with the Hayekian political economy, especially as it relates to the concept of decentralization as a form of direct democracy, and how these things can actually really be, very contradictory. And it's a political economy and it's a political history that is actually like should be foundational for anyone that's getting involved in this space, really, especially also because what we have is a bunch of engineers that are tinkering around with essentially with political economy, but with very little training in that field, and so they kind of oftentimes draw quite kind of haphazardly on political economists that have been discredited for very good reasons in the past, like 20, 30, 40 years.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's important because there is the legacy of the Hayekian economics is something that we're still living through. I mean, it's been hugely kind of damaging to a lot of societies, and so we need to really recognize those facts.
Yeah, I think. Are you saying that like people should learn about Hayek foundationally as a way to discredit him?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's not enough. I mean, I think I've been thinking that I need to write up like a kind of like spiffy counter to Hayek, because my problem, I mean, my problem is like I mean, I personally I love reading Hayek, and I also said that in the talk. Like I
Yeah.
enjoy reading Hayek, and I enjoy reading white papers, and part of the reason why I enjoy reading these things is because they're super nice mental puzzles, right? They're very kind of satisfactory as a set of simple organizing principles that can be very kind of elaborate and complex, but like that is exactly also their danger, because it paints this kind of like very convincing picture of how the world operates. But in actual fact, it's just this very particular, weird, curious view on how the world should operate that then becomes very violent when it actually becomes deployed. And that's what we saw with Hayek in economics, where essentially what has happened through uh, especially in the adoption of Hayekian economics in kind of neoliberal policies, is the kind of rollout of the market, and the market as a kind of decentralized information processor, to across like entire parts of the world, with like no consideration whatsoever about the kind of the effects on real people's lives.
Sometimes I feel, because I've talked to some people who are really into Hayek before, and I get the impression that for them, like neoliberalism is not Hayekian. Like it was like a, I don't know, like they messed up Hayek's what Hayek said, and then included the state too much, and that was
Yeah,
a
exactly.
problem.
It wasn't pure. It wasn't pure
Right?
enough,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
impure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, we can talk a bit more about the relationship between the state and the market as well. But the idea of having the idea of even being able to impose Hayekian markets without the brute force of the state to back it is just ridiculous. I mean, like people just simply would not adopt it. There's
Spicy,
no
spicy
nat.
for Hayekians.
Yeah, I mean, like there, absolutely. But it's also, it's I don't see the counter attack to that. Like, the there's no naturally emerging Hayekian market.
For like, I guess what you mean is like the enforcement of private property.
The enforcement of private property, the enforcement of market relations across all social dynamics is really at the, that's the kind of core assumption of the Hayekian market. Like in order for the market to operate as an effective decentralized information processor, you need the information to be plugged into that information processor, which means that you need more and more interactions and relationships to happen via the market.
Mhm.
And that just simply, that's just it just simply doesn't work out that way unless you have someone actually kind of like making sure that it does.
Right.
I mean, that might not be a state, it could be some other dude with a big gun, but at the end of the day, like, someone's got to kind of like make people behave that way.
Right. Like, do you see, I don't know, Hayekian thought, like, do you see Hayekian thought being practiced or like realized through crypto? Like, do you think they actually achieved their Hayekian, some of them, their like Hayekian dreams, so to say?
Well, I mean, achieved their dreams is a bit kind of hard to say because, well, you can't really. I mean, to what extent, right? Like within certain kind of like
Small
within
bubbles.
certain kind of bubbles. Yeah, exactly. Because at the end of the day, like, as a game, it's like why not, right? I mean, sure, let's play a little Hayekian game, within some kind of like token economic system. Why not, right? Um, but I mean, I think both the thinking and we can refer to Hayek, but like game theory obviously also has a whole bunch of other authors and stuff. It's like there's these kind of bigger fields that So in general, I would say like yes, the kind of the general idea of the market as an information processor is definitely present within a lot of thinking in the crypto space, and also the market as a behavioral engineering program is very much present in much of the kind of crypto space. People designing crypto economic systems tend to be very concerned about how to make people behave correctly.
Right, right, yeah. So then, I guess, given that context of what these people are maybe trying to do,
Yeah,
or how the crypto world acts, what are some of the things that give you cautious optimism, like that you mentioned in your talk,
I
or things you would like to see?
um
I think you kind of framed it as.
things that I would like to see. I mean, I think I've always been of the position that crypto raises all the right questions, but doesn't really provide the answers, right? So it's not, for me, like crypto is not like the solution or anything, but it continues to raise all the right questions. And I really appreciate that about crypto, because it raises all the right questions at all the right times. But I think it is time now that it's been doing that for a while, and by that I mean the right questions in terms of power, in terms of the nature of money, in terms of how money mediates social relationships, how market mediate social relationships, the fact that these things can be done differently, and the fact that we can come together in groups to do these things differently, and that we can come together and make decisions around how we want to design those systems. I think all of that is like pretty fascinating and pretty major, and I feel pretty kind of positive about that. Um, However, I do feel that the space of experimentation is way too small, and also experimentation taking place in the context of late stage capitalism, and in the context of now war and increasing nationalisms. Um, I mean, I say now war. There's been ongoing wars for quite some time, but let's say the stakes of geopolitics is upped
Mhm.
quite a bit in the past month. Um, yeah, that I think we can't ignore that broader context. So any idea that like, okay, great, crypto just opens up a design space and we can design utopias as much as dystopias, or let's say, you know, crypto might be looking pretty right wing right now, but we can encode some left wing politics into it, and then we'll be fine. It's like that's we need to kind of wake up to the fact that that's not enough. Like the context really matters, and the context is really shaping what is likely to be successful and what's not going to be successful in terms of economic designs in the crypto space. And I think it's important to reflect on that for anyone who's trying to push things in a kind of more interesting direction, politically speaking.
Yeah, I've
So yeah, I have cautious optimism still, because why not? I mean, we need to kind of like keep plugging away at things. um, but yeah, but I see some very specific problems.
yeah. I remember you had mentioned like mutual aid as being something you wanted to see more of during the talk, I believe.
Yeah. I mean, in the talk, there I was thinking in the very specific kind of use case of artists and artist-led spaces. And so, I think ways of kind of sharing economic resources across borders, and kind of creating kind of interest groups that are, let's say, um, creating interest groups that are able to govern their shared funds in new and easy ways, I think is like something that like allows for a type of mutual aid that like can come to play a pretty big role as like regions and places like I think inequality, we're going to start to see kind of inequality becoming exacerbated across regions, and I think the ability to kind of like try and counterbalance that through kind of networks of mutual aid, and I guess like yeah, just networks, communities of different forms is going to be important. Yeah.
Like I mentioned before, what I liked about your work is that you're much more willing to give crypto space as I guess I could say like a left leaning academic than like many others are sort of willing to, from what I see. Where do you think some of these critics get wrong by trying to? I think it seems to me that they're trying to like neatly fit the creation of Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies into like neoliberalism or like
Yeah.
fascism or something like that. Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess first I think it's important to say that I tend to actually agree with most critics, but I'm always like I agree with them, but it's like I agree with them, but it's not the full story. And I feel like shutting it down to just a critique is just it's not yeah, it doesn't give the full story, and doesn't give the full story of what's yeah, what's possible. And I guess I mean, where they get it wrong. mm,
Like if I were to take a stab, it seems to me that it's sort of like you sometimes people just like recognize certain patterns
yeah,
in the crypto world that they already like it looks like something else that they already know is like bad
yeah,
and sort of like try to one for one lay that on top of and be like it's the same thing.
yeah. I mean, it's a little bit. I mean, I'm taking my time to answer this question because it's kind of it relates to a lot of other things that are going on for me, and I think for quite a few other people right now, which is the having been trained in critical thinking, having been trained in a kind of anti-capitalist analysis, to put it bluntly, like that's kind of like that is the knives. Those are the knives that have been sharpened. That is the perspective.
Yeah.
And although I think that perspective is super valid, there's also, I mean, to me, it really is like we're no longer at a point in time where we need to kind of focus so much on the kind of uh, like I feel like the cracks are very evident
Mm,
in systems everywhere, and so I'm personally less interested in kind of repeating the critical narrative over and over and over again, and I'm becoming much more interested in looking at what might potentially be new, what might potentially be different this time, where might the potential openings be. And I know that can be very hard, especially for generations of people, or yeah, people who were very involved in the early days of the internet and feel like their early dreams were smashed by what happened in both Web 2 and now potentially Web 3 as well. So I can understand where the cynicism comes from. I can understand the broken dreams, and I take the critiques very seriously, because there's important lessons there, both the critiques that come from the kind of the economic side of things, but also the technical side of things, that decentralization is a very naive position to take if that's what you think it all is, the only thing that's at stake.
for sure. Yeah. So one of the ways that that in one of your papers, it's called, I have it right here, Hacker Engineers and Their Economies, the Political Economy of Decentralized Networks and Crypto Economics.
Yes.
But in that paper, you talk about almost like, I guess you call it a protagonist. You call it the hacker engineer as sort
Yeah.
of like a new protagonist in this world of decentralized networks and I guess largely in the context of cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
But what do you think is sort of like particularly distinct about this class of people, maybe we could say, in this political economy, or like I guess compared to other ones?
Yeah, well, what I wanted to there were two things that I wanted to point to in this paper, and it actually relates very much to your previous question. I wanted to really push back on, so David Columbia as an example. I love his work. I think his critiques of Bitcoin are in many ways valid, and I know a lot of people in the Bitcoin space would hate me for saying that. Um, but uh, but I also wanted to push back on him in this specifically with this paper, exactly because like I wanted to talk about this protagonist as having less of a, and here I'm not just talking about Bitcoin. I'm actually primarily talking about the rest of the crypto space. Like the engineers that I see operating in this space that are designing token economic systems are simply less interested in in right wing political economies per se, and much more interested in just tinkering with whatever economies. I mean, they see it as a design space, and so I wanted to kind of like open up the space for engagement from by critical thinkers to be like, hey man, just get involved, right? You don't have to kind of point out where things are potentially getting too right wing or looking too much like Hayek or looking too much like Rothbard. Um, you can actually get involved because what this protagonist of the hacker engineer is more interested in, or let's say the political dogmas of the hacker engineer that's involved in the crypto space, has to do with decentralization. It has to do with cryptography and the power of these two things to reshape the balances of power in infrastructures and in monetary infrastructures and payment systems. And for me, it's like, man, that's interesting. I mean, that
Yeah.
is interesting, and that should be interesting for any radical on the left as well.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that and also to kind of to name these people and their designs as protagonists that are actually starting to play an active role in shaping political economies. But it's a kind of it's a role that does not look like the policymaker and does not look like the economist. It's an engineer, it's a computer engineer, it's computer scientists. And so like they have a different set of interests and they have a different way of intervening in political economy, which is by designing infrastructure, designing systems, and deploying cryptography and different cryptographic techniques. And it's a kind of material engagement, or let's say, it's funny to call it material, right? Because
Digitally material.
yeah, exactly. But let's say it's a form of it's a non-human intervention or something. I don't know, can't
Right.
quite find the right word right now. But yeah, it's an infrastructural intervention into political economy, right? And so infrastructure and this protagonist of the hacker engineer has become a player, as a central banker or regulator and so on.
Yeah, I sometimes well, like first off, I definitely agree with that sentiment, or like that, like this protagonist exists, I think, for sure. If
Mhm.
you if you are able to have the opportunity to meet these engineers who are building all these systems, like a lot of them may have like read a little bit of Hayek, but they aren't like Hayekians. It tends to be
Yeah,
like a different class of people who are like that. It is more like the hype men are maybe like the Hayekians a bit, and then
yeah,
the hacker engineers are sort of just like um, ultra
which is
nerdy,
exactly.
trying their best to sort of connect maybe different abstract political thoughts they may have to their work, which I find interesting as well.
Yeah,
And it,
and they're trying to solve pretty advanced problems, and
yeah,
it's like, I
indeed.
don't know, I feel like engaging in that in with a more kind of generous mind is super important, and I see
Yeah, you
this.
should
I
be
mean, I
nice to
see.
them, I think, partially, if they're
Yeah,
going to be
yeah.
building the future.
Well, I am. No, I like engaging. I really like engaging, and it's a schism that I see kind of happening over and over again. Also by, we can go broader than, just talk about kind of social sciences in general. It's like there is just a bit of a kind of there's a kind of stereotype of what the kind of, the technologist, the evil technologist or the evil computer scientist might look like or whatever. And it's like, man, just they're actually like really interesting nerds that are trying to do super interesting things. And I think a bit more kind of engagement across the divide would be very good for both parties.
It's sort of, to me, a bit. annoying that it feels like almost like what you studied has become politicized.
Yeah,
Like if you studied social sciences, you're on the left, but if you studied STEM, you're on the right. Like as if
exactly.
that actually like exists or matters. I find it so ridiculous.
But actually, just on that paper, while we're on the topic, also, it's it's also important for people, for critics, to start to engage with some of the political differences internally in the crypto space, right?
Yeah,
So, like, I hesitated a little bit there earlier when I was saying, like, when I mentioned Bitcoin, because Bitcoin, you know, to some degree more than many other crypto, but I think most crypto does contain, some certain kind of key um, reference points, right? And Bitcoin, in terms of kind of like, gold and the relationship to gold and all this kind of thing, like there is some, there are monetary ideas that have definitely been uh, kind of circulated a lot and kind of adopted by Bitcoiners without necessarily knowing the political precursors to that. And that's where
mm,
I'm like, Colombia is right in many ways, but it's not the full picture.
yeah,
It's really not the full picture, and especially if you look at the people that were engaged in Bitcoin in early days, and the people involved in the conversations around Bitcoin in early days, there was a lot more going on.
yeah.
I mean, here I'm thinking of Jaramil and Amir Taki and all those people.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of, yeah. I've mentioned it before, but I just found the book. Not that it was like the right wing politics of Bitcoin book. Not that it was like wrong per se about everything, but that it was lacking a lot. I
Yeah,
felt.
yeah, definitely. And it was lacking exactly that other aspect to the decentralization agenda and the whole kind of history. I mean, there's so much that hasn't been written up yet, like properly, like the kind of the more kind of left leaning histories of peer to peer as well.
Right.
Um, that I think is important to kind of acknowledge.
It felt. I mean, yeah. To our previous conversation, I mean, I don't know Colombia at all as a person, but it felt that it was sort of. It felt like when I was reading like a social sciences versus STEM type
Yeah.
of mentality that I was kind of like frustrated with.
Mm.
But so you also wrote, going to the next paper I wanted to talk about, or the article that you had written, was something you wrote in the Agorism in the 21st Century Journal, who I also spoke to Rose and Dylan, who are, or Paul, who are editors of the journal, and that interview should be coming out probably before this one comes out. But it was really interesting because you talked about markets in like yeah, in a way that sort of like the, I don't want to say dualistic, but like contradictions of markets and how to view them and whether they are good or bad. Because you called it, the title of the article is "The Market as a Gun to Your Head, Tool in Your Hand, or Escape Route from Hell,"
Yeah.
which was like,
Very dramatic title.
yeah, but it was. I mean, yeah. Again, it was able to sort of articulate some of the thoughts that I had as well about markets. I don't really know what to do with or how to explain it to other people's,
Yeah.
maybe on other people like on the left. Because I think, like you mentioned earlier, if you grow up in like a left wing, I guess, political tradition, you're sort of like the default is sort of like markets are bad, and like the existence of markets is generally just like a bad thing that you should be against. Um,
Yeah.
with sometimes I guess there are some like market anarchists who would maybe be against that on the left, or yeah, the alternative being just like planned economy or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was wondering how you how you went about writing that piece.
Yeah, so the agorism essay was written up in a bit of a kind of frenzy of trying to counter a little bit the kind of market anarchist position, I guess, that agorism really, subscribes to. Partially because I felt that, again, I mean, we touched upon this a little bit earlier in our chat, but this idea that markets in any easy way exist without state coercion, I felt was a little bit kind of, especially in today's day and age, a little bit incorrect and like historically incorrect. So I wanted to kind of in the article just like very quickly kind of like smash those two things together, because people for some reason still tend to think about markets and states as opposed to one another when actually they're absolutely intricately linked. The market needs the state for enforcement, and the state needs the market in order to encourage economic stimulation and get taxes. So this you now we have this kind of very entangled kind of relationship between the two. So I wanted to kind of push back on the market anarchist positions a little bit to kind of with that piece, but also to argue that markets represent a form of coercion in their own right. Um, and so there's not, Marcus does not equate freedom in any easy way. It's another kind of it's just another form of coercion. So that was a kind of like the first aim of the piece. But then, like you say, I also say, talk about it as a tool in your hand, or as an escape route from hell. And that's kind of because I'm really kind of sick and tired of the stereotypical positions of like for and against or whatever that kind of get assigned to different political categories, because at a certain point we also have to kind of acknowledge the kind of immediate experience that people are having. And markets and economic freedom is often very much experienced as economic freedom, right? It's like, well, when it works for people, it works very, it really can literally mean, freedom. And to ignore that with some kind of like leftist dogma is just like, it's boring and it's incorrect and it's lazy and it's not acknowledging the contradictions that we're living within. And so it doesn't give us much kind of like kind of ground in reality to actually move forward with. It's just a repetition of dogmas over and over again. And that's, I mean, that latter point is something that I want to work on a lot more. What does kind of, monetary forms of freedom actually really kind of mean, and what is the relationship between what you experience as an individual and what's going on a kind of structural level, right?
Hey everyone, if you're enjoying the episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. And if you're enjoying the interview or find the content that I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Manuel, Yinwo, and Ennis. Any amount really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer. And I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. Or in the last bonus episode, I actually spoke to 2 other crypto leftists who went to ETH Denver, and we spoke about their experiences there, including the good, the bad, and the ugly. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. I tend to think of markets that markets, like you said, are a form of coercion, that we are sort of like, at least if you are born and grow up in, Western, liberal capitalist countries, and you are sort of like forced to partake in the market without much like other options anyway. So it's never really like, it's never presented really as a choice, even though like, I don't know, shitty right wingers will say like, well, if you don't like it, then move or something like that. But it has like you said, if you make a lot of money, then it works great for you. Markets are doing wonderful things, and like Hayek was right. But if you are, I don't know, unemployed and you can't find a job in the labor market, then it's sort of like a very coercive thing.
Yeah.
And that sort of gets ignored. But then I think that at the same time, I'm just very skeptical that the market is going to go away anytime soon, or like just sort of like disappear whenever our magical socialist government sort of comes into power.
Yeah. Well, that was the other point that I wanted to make, really, was, in the piece, which is that, like, markets and states don't just exist kind of out there. They're also kind of deeply embedded in our behavioral patterns, as individuals and collectively. So, the kind of tendency to reproduce, the state and reproduce market perspectives, or even reproduce the police in the way that we behave between each other, is yeah, it's another one of the big problems. But on the question of whether markets are going to disappear or not, like markets just as money, I don't think are going to. They're not disappearing. I mean, they're really just splintering into a whole new variety of shapes and forms. Um, in and it's very hard to kind of put a finger on what exactly that's going to look like. But it's kind of, I think, the kind of merge of, I mean, I guess to take it back to Hayek, if we think of markets as an information processor and the fact that so much kind of structural policies has kind of incorporated that outlook, um, you know, that we can then think of money as a very crude form of data in that information processor. And where now, instead of kind of money as a crude, in that crude form of data, and here I'm talking about like fungible tokens or cash even, um, we're entering a space where we're going to have much more fine-grained forms of data swirling around this giant information processor. So like they kind of, it's almost like, I guess, like, I mean, computation and markets have had a kind of, in intellectual history, have had quite a kind of intertwined relationship always. So like Hayek, obviously, when saying the market as information processor, was inspired by what was going on in computation at that time. Um, but like I think they're gonna. I mean, yeah, they're almost gonna merge. I guess is what I'm saying, and in kind of weird ways where money becomes fragmented into a lot of different data points that sometimes serve the purpose of reputation and sometimes serve the purpose of taking stock of accounting or whatever else,
Right. Yeah, I feel like that's something that I'm seeing as well. I think it's interesting. There's still like the sort of awkwardness that a lot of these tokens, like reputation or governance, if that's like a different form of value, still a lot of the times have, like, they're just like for example, like an ERC20 token. It's like you can just put it on any sort of decentralized exchange. So you can always like sort of pick out, you can always get like a financial value out of it
Yeah,
to a certain degree. But
exactly.
there are ways, I mean, I think there isn't, you can make it so that it doesn't. You could, but
Yeah,
you don't see it very
but
much.
that's an interesting point as well. I mean, first of all, I'd be interested to hear how you could see that you could make it so that it doesn't, because I'm not quite sure if that's. I think it's almost too late for that. But I am interested in. I mean, a whole other kind of research strand that came up during my PhD was this question of like what happens when you integrate economic ideas or economic design into the information security space, right? Which is essentially what token economics does, right?
Mm.
On a very basic level, it's like incentivize good behavior, disincentivize or punish bad behavior, right? Um, and using kind of economic incentives as a means to protect against various forms of attacks, right? Whether civil attacks or whatever else. Um, but I've found it so kind of curious and interesting to see how many new forms of attacks that opens up for, right? Because you integrate economic incentives, well then all of a sudden there is an economic incentive to perform attacks, right? And so um, I think the economization of computation is something that I would love to kind of, or it's an open strand of research for me that I would love to dive into more, and economization and financialization of computation and what that actually does to what the proposition of computation, like what we're actually trying to achieve with computer systems. Like, does it get in the way of that? Does it enable that? And I think it does a little bit of both, but it's also transforming it into um, something wildly different.
Which I imagine you're getting exposed a lot through NIM.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
Yes.
but no, but I didn't want to, like, I don't know how you feel about it because you've probably read more Hayek than me, but this more types of money popping up seems to almost contradict Hayek a bit. It seems like not Hayekian.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's another kind of part to that agorism piece that, so there was the market as a gun to your head, which is like markets as coercion, right? And then the market as a tool in your hand, and the market as escape route from hell. And the market as a tool in your hand, we didn't talk about that yet. And that's a little bit kind of this other position that is like, money becoming multiple different forms. There, I wanted to highlight a shift that's also happened in in the field of economics, and to some degree political economy, or more like social studies of finance, is actually the people that are starting to look at this more closely. But which is a shift in, it's people are kind of noting that, like, actually, market thinking by economists is less about that, is less referring to kind of Hayekian, the Hayekian perfect market, let's say, and is more referring to markets as a bespoke design solution, right? So the idea that you can design markets to achieve a variety of different things, and that's more in line with what's actually happening in the crypto space, right? It's like these kind of bespoke little markets that are solving specific game theoretical problems for specific types of use cases and system design, or specific kind of information security requirements. And that's also, it's something that for me has been eye-opening and important to note, because it just shows again that it's the allegiance to right-wing thinking is just not so strong. I mean,
Yeah.
it really isn't. It's not really what people care about. Like, people are not ideological in that sense.
I think the hack, like what you mean, like with like the hacker engineer, does not care to be a purist Hayekian in the way that like
Exactly.
that their Hayekian hype men want them to be. I don't think. I think they're
Exactly.
more interested in, like solving problems in a
Making a
particular way.
system work. Exactly.
So I feel that I still have like developing this thought, so I'm afraid to share it. But like it seems to me like there's going to be a need for some amount of like almost like social democracy within these systems, but like a stateless social democracy in a certain way, where they are sort of like, it seems to me, I think a lot of these hacker engineers are trying to look for ways to sort of like prevent the attacks that come from the market.
Yeah.
Almost like reducing the exposure to the free market for certain aspects of their systems. And they're doing it in like interesting, creative ways that, okay, maybe are or are not socialism or social democracy in the way that you want to define it, but I think are like interesting to pay attention to at the very least.
Yeah. It's I mean, let's see what will happen, because the problem, I think we can't run away from the fact that, like, by adding economic dynamics into, the design of computer system protocols, like, or decentralized protocols, like, you just add a hell of a lot of complexity to what's going on. And that
True.
complexity is only necessary insofar as, I mean, like, if we're going to be pragmatic about it, adding that level of complexity is only there to get the VC money. I mean, let's be real. Like, there's a lot of kind of.
I think it depends. I would say it depends.
Sure. I mean, you're maybe less cynical than I am right now.
I've been pretty cynical lately, so.
Yeah, like, I think again, it's I tend to take kind of quite contradictory positions on these things, but, like, I think there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on, but generally speaking, in terms of actual deployment and use, like,
it's the minority
many
for
times,
sure. I mean,
no
doubt.
It is the minority. Like, like when
money wise.
Yeah,
but I think at least I don't have any. I never like convinced myself that hacker engineers are going to magically create socialism or something like that. Like, I feel like that's sort of like a silly thing to think, especially when they are surrounded largely by like Hayekians, for example, or like people who are more on the right. So I don't expect them to make the system that I would ideally want them to create. But I think it's interesting to observe what they're creating, and then I think it is worthy of my time, at least, to try and sort of share my feedback on maybe what they're building and like try to be a part of it.
Yeah.
That's sort of how I see
it. I mean, for sure. And the social democracy aspect is, I mean, that's an interesting thought. I think there is
a very rudimentary social democracy, let me say. Like, I'm not really, I mean that very lightly. Like, I still haven't just come up with like a better word, right?
I mean, the question of governance is obviously key here,
Yeah.
and how that governance like will or will not take place, and who's able to kind of like access that form of governance. But yeah, like there is, there is an interesting kind of, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking about the kind of this planned versus pure kind of like the planned economy versus kind of the market economy take. That I think we're going to see really weird blends, really weird
Yeah.
mixes of that.
Yeah.
That where it's not going to look like one or the other form. It's going to be actually a little bit of a kind of strange combination. Um, Again, like bespoke markets, but maybe some element of kind of like cybernetic planning going on that then is semi-automated, and maybe there's interesting governance added to that, or maybe it's just like purely algorithmic kind of fascism, but it will take these type these variety of forms. Yeah. um yeah, let's see.
Yeah.
I'm trying to kind of draw up some pieces of like, okay, where are the front lines here, of these, where are the front lines of these debates? Like, how are things, what are the kind of key theses?
What is difficult, I think, at the same time is that the front lines that we're talking about, I think, are not at the front lines of like media or like of
Yeah.
like influence at like a larger scale. Like I think there are these
Well,
pockets of oh, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm not too concerned about that, because for me, this right now we've kind of we've entered a little bit of a phase of like, it's a long-term game for me at this point. So I'm okay with like taking a moment to really kind of think about it before like before we kind of like from my perspective, before kind of like re-intervening full force on the political economy side of things anyway. On the privacy side of things, I'm definitely part of intervening.
Yeah. So actually, I wanted to talk about, of course, your work at NIM, since you started off as a researcher in, I think, academia, and you've like talked about the sort of solution, the like the critique of like the solutionism in cryptocurrency. But now you are a part of NIM, which is like a Web3 company.
Yep.
And like my suspicion, but of course you can like tell me if I'm wrong, but I guess like part of the decision of doing that was choosing to want to actively engage in the cryptocurrency space to some capacity, rather than just relegating yourself as like, yeah, a critic of some sort.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true. And also, I would add to that that NIM is one of the few projects in the Web3 space that I actually would get involved in, because it it's one of the few kind of use cases where I really do feel like it makes sense. Like if we pull it off, it makes sense. And I'll try and explain a little bit why. NIM is a global decentralized privacy system, which is comprised of a mixnet. And what a mixnet does is it's kind of like a extremely powerful type of VPN in a sense. But so it takes internet traffic, mixes it with other traffic so that you can't see who's speaking to who, makes all the traffic look essentially the same. So you can't kind of trace what type of data is being sent through the network. And it creates a kind of like a shroud, let's say, over communications. So one of the reasons why decentralization is super important in order to ensure privacy of this kind is because, if you don't have decentralization and you have like one part of the infrastructure that the rest of the system actually depends on, that part becomes hugely vulnerable to anyone trying to hack the privacy of the system. And by creating a fully decentralized system, there is no centralized point of control that can actually give access to the data, and so you kind of eliminate some of the vulnerability there. The other aspect to that is that you have the problem that we're facing when it comes to privacy online is that it's one of those things that like everybody wants it, but no one has the incentive to really provide it, and to provide it well right now. So nation states really want privacy because that kind of helps the national security agenda, but on the other hand, they can't help but want to put in a kind of backdoor because they want to know what their populations are up to, and they want to understand like if they have, enemies amongst the population, and so they end up kind of breaking their own security in a sense. And companies the same, right? They want to kind of like satisfy the growing demand for privacy, but on the other hand, they want to know everything about their customers. And it's interesting, like even I would say, even when you talk to privacy companies, privacy companies even want to know what their customers are up to. And that's why it's important to have a privacy system where even the company itself has no control over the infrastructure. And that's what we're trying to do at NIM. Um, but when you then when you then create a decentralized infrastructure like this, you have other examples that are very good, like Tor. But Tor faces a lot of limitations, and especially around kind of scaling and sustainability in the long run. And then there's a bunch of other kind of technical limitations. But I'd leave that to Claudia Diaz and Anya Petrowska to explain. But we're trying to kind of ensure that nodes that operate the infrastructure, the mixed nodes that actually operate the infrastructure, are compensated well for doing so, and compensated enough to cover their costs and to also happily continue to run the infrastructure. There's more to the crypto economics. I mean, I can explain, like, apart from the nodes being rewarded, the token in the NIM system also operates as a reputation token. So anybody who holds NIM tokens can bond or like can delegate those tokens to mixed nodes that then act as that mixed node's reputation, which will give it a kind of boost, and it will allow it to mix more traffic and get rewarded more in the network. And so there's a kind of decentralized reputation system that ensures quality control in the network as well. I mean, I don't want to go. We can do a whole podcast in the crypto economics.
Yeah.
But the point that I think the key thing that was important for me with the NIM system is that the token really is a token. It's not claiming to be a currency of any form. It's not claiming to kind of have any use outside of that internal system dynamics. And so, like, just like we were speaking about before, it's like, okay, you can create these economic games, and then you run them in this kind of like in this bubble universe, and we can see how they play out. And for me, it makes a lot of sense in the NIM system, and I'm quite happy to see how that plays out for a privacy system like this in that kind of contained environment.
Yeah. I think when you explain it that way, like, I can see why. Well, to me, the token seems almost like a Hayekian signaling system to a certain degree, but it's still not like, it's not money, or like in the way that Hayek, as far as I understand, describes money as being like a signaling system for compressing information.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very kind of like, it's a very, because the use of the token internally is such a kind of like limited use. It doesn't seem very Hayekian to me. It's almost more as like a I don't know, like Chelsea Manning recently joined our team, and she started to describe it as like in some ways it's almost like you're paying for a bus fare. It's like if you think of the NIM privacy system as like a bus that your traffic takes through the kind of internet or whatever. It's like you hand over your token, which allows you to take that bus. And then, I mean, the reputation system is like, again, like if we want to take a kind of ideologically pure perspective on token driven reputation systems, and I've spoken to people who totally freak out when they hear that, and I would have freaked out when I heard that if it was like a generalized system. But we're talking about node operators here, and we're not talking about human beings in the sense that, like, the node operator,
like a social credit
person.
score or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a social credit score. It's like, it's literally like the operator of a node, and it's not even like that person's like name or anything like that. It's literally just the kind of node ID. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of and it kind of matches very much like the general ethos that we have in the project, which is we want to ensure, high quality of service, and we want to ensure transparency of the actual infrastructure itself as a way to enable privacy for users, right? And those users include node operators who might want to use the system to protect their own privacy, but the operations of their actual node, the location of the server that they're running and so on. Like, this stuff is like, is quite important for the network to be provably decentralized, for it to be transparent, that it actually operates the way that it's supposed to operate, and so on. So like we make that kind of distinction.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to maybe say is that if you are a Hayekian and you view things in a Hayekian framework, then it's easy for you
Yeah.
to see that token as like fulfilling Hayek's dream, even though it's like, from my understanding, like an incorrect understanding of Hayek.
Yeah, I mean, it is, because it's sure, like, the tokens signal certain things, but we're not in any way proposing that it gives the full picture of what's going on in society in general.
Right.
We're just saying it signals that this node is generally trusted by the community and seems to have done a good job in the past, like, 4 months or however long.
Right. Yeah.
So it's about the kind of like the contained use case and the contained proposition, and yeah, it's one of the few projects where I'm thinking it's definitely worth trying this out for this particular use case.
Yeah, it's a really nice project. I think it's really interesting, and it's hard to, I don't know, I guess if explaining NIM to maybe a fellow lefty, maybe they're more likely to be like, okay, I'll give you a
Yeah.
little bit of space.
Yeah.
I would like to think. I don't know if you've had any
Yeah.
experience trying to explain it and how that went
No,
to
for
anti-crypto
sure.
people.
I mean, well, Chelsea is not very. She doesn't like crypto, and she's happily involved. I mean, we've got endorsement from quite a lot of crypto skeptics. So let's see how it goes. It is an experimentation. I think, let's see how it goes. I think when it comes to kind of like market volatility and stuff like that, there's a lot of dynamics that remain to be seen. But yeah, I think as a kind of as a system design and as a particular use case, I think it's definitely well worth trying it out.
Yeah, you'll find out if the market will be your friend or your enemy soon enough.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well,
Yeah.
thanks a lot for taking the time to speak with me. Maybe if you just want to share with people where they can keep up with you and your work.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that for the past year at least have been so busy that I haven't managed to update much of my online presence. And my website has been hacked and
Oh, wow.
by crypto shillers.
Really? I missed that.
Yeah, I found out, like, I hadn't even looked at my own website for like a long time, and then I looked at it the other day, and it turned out that it had been hacked. So people were trying to sell crypto on my URL. Anyway, so that's now down.
Okay.
But generally speaking, I think the easiest place to follow me is on Twitter, and I'm Jaya Papaya. So that's JayaPapaya. And I tend to be Jaya Papaya on most things. So that's the easiest way to find me.
That is a great username. All right.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.